We were getting to chapter 47 last Wednesday evening. And you may recall, and this is just an update to those who are not here on Wednesday evenings, where we are in our current setting, is that you'll recall that Joseph had been sold into Egypt. By the way, who sold him into Egypt? His brothers. And he was falsely accused in Egypt, thrown into prison. He interpreted some dreams while in prison. And then when Pharaoh had a dream that he didn't know what it meant, the butler told him that, Joseph can interpret dreams. And Joseph points out that it's only God who can reveal what the dreams are. But he interprets Pharaoh's dream, and what was the dream? Not necessarily, but what was the meaning of the dream that Pharaoh had? Right, 7 good years, prosperous, and then there's going to be 7 years of devastation, famine. And so he went ahead and advised him to go ahead and lay up in store, prepare for those 7 years of famine. And he says, set a man over it who can guide this. And Pharaoh says, what's a better man in whom the Spirit of God is than Joseph? And so Joseph is, promoted to second in command of all of Egypt. And so from prison to second in command over basically a world power. And so he behaved himself wisely in bad circumstances, and God has promoted him to this. And now then, because of the famine, who has to come to Egypt to get gain? That is, to get some grain, I should say. All right, his brothers, the very ones who sold him into captivity. They do not recognize him. He knows who they are. And Joseph was 17 years of age when he was sold into captivity. He's now 30 years of age. And so these 13 years have passed. And by the way, he did not even speak to them in the Hebrew tongue, but rather he spoke through an interpreter. So they don't know who he is. They come down. They finally, though, through a series of events, Joseph reveals who he is, and he is now bringing his family down into Egypt. This is how then Israel, the nation, will actually wind up in Egypt. And then when you take up the book of Exodus, you'll have the Exodus out of Egypt. And so that's where we are, in that the family has now come down to Egypt, and what a magnanimous spirit that Joseph has, and that he realizes this God who did all of this, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, in order that he might prepare for this famine and how that I can take care of you. So he doesn't have a revengeful bone in his body. He's not trying to get back at anyone. He's saying he can see the hand of God in this. And I'm just thinking, you know what, that was better for them, but you know what was also better for Joseph, wasn't it? And when we go around thinking about how somebody has wronged us, and their time's coming and all that tends to make us miserable, doesn't it? And so it's better for us to leave vengeance up to God. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord, than to try to get even with those who may have said or done something against us. Now, that's not always easy, but it's always right. And Joseph has done what is right. Well, the family has come down. Joseph has been reunited with his father after all these years. And so we come to chapter 47, and I alluded to some of the events that happened here. Then Joseph came and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brethren and their flocks and their herds and all that they have are come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen, that was a fertile area and prosperous area. We're going to learn a little bit more about something about Goshen here in just a moment. So he took some of his brethren, even 5 men, and presented them unto Pharaoh. Doesn't take them all, just 5. And Pharaoh said unto his brethren, what is your occupation? They said unto Pharaoh, thy servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. That's what Joseph had told them to say. They said, moreover unto Pharaoh, for to sojourn in the land are we come, for thy servants have no pasture for their flocks. The famine's taken care of that, dried it up. For the famine is sore in the land of Canaan. Now, therefore, we pray thee, let thy servants dwell in the land of Goshen. Goshen was not a large land. By the way, I think I mentioned Wednesday evening that Canaan itself is not a large land, yet it is called a land that flows with milk and honey, and it's called a large land in the Bible. It is large in comparison to Goshen. We might not call it as large today as some of the other places. Pharaoh spake unto Joseph, saying, thy father and thy brethren are come unto thee. The land of Egypt is before thee. In the best of the land make thy father and brethren to dwell. This tells us just how much respect Pharaoh has for Joseph. You take care of your family. You put them in the best of the land. And not only that, and if thou knowest any men of activity among them, let them what? Okay, notice, you let them be rulers over my cattle. So, based upon the wisdom that Joseph had, here's his family. If Joseph endorses them, well, you put them over my cattle. You take care of my welfare, my wealth, and in essence, you might say, in a real way, he's his stockbroker, isn't he? That is the real stock, being cattle. And so that's the confidence that God has caused Pharaoh to have for Joseph, that once prisoner. So Joseph brings in Jacob, his father, and I find this interesting. It's going to say it at least twice, that Jacob blesses Pharaoh. Pharaoh's the king. Pharaoh's the wealthy one. Pharaoh's the one that's got everything. But yet Jacob, God's child, blesses that king. And kings have been blessed because of righteous people and the way that they have been favorable to God's children. And so Jacob blesses Pharaoh. That's going to be stated again in just a moment. Jacob is asked by Pharaoh, how old are you? And how old was he at this point? 130 years. But he says, few and evil have the days of the years of my life been. Well, we wouldn't say that's few. But when you think about some of his forefathers, Abraham lived to be, 185? Of course, you go on back years earlier, closer to the flood. By the way, did you know that Abraham, if you look on a timeline, Abraham lived to see some of Jacob's children? That is, as far as the age is concerned. We don't have any record of that interaction. But we might, when we finish reading about one, we go to Abraham, then we go to Isaac, and then we come down to Jacob. But if you look on a timeline, as far as their lives, you'll see that Abraham and Jacob's lives overlap. And so even when some of his children are born, then Abraham would have still been alive. And I would think, wouldn't it be interesting to talk about your grandfather or great-grandfather Abraham? Well, but because of the longevity of those years, that's natural. And so I encourage you sometime, if you can find one, to look at a timeline of some of the patriarchs and realize Adam lived this long. Okay, who else lived during that time that we know? You start with Noah then, and you go on, and that's just interesting to me to see how that their lives then would have overlapped. But he says, few and evil have the days of the years of my life been, and I've not attained unto the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. Few and evil. There's been a lot of evil things that have happened in the life of Jacob. We'll not go back, obviously, and do that and study all those things. But I'm thinking about even the evil report that he got concerning his son Joseph, how devastating that was, and then how that's turned around. And he's got to realize at some point what his other sons have done. And A lot of things that have happened to him. And by the way, the name Jacob, he started out especially, what does the word Jacob mean? Supplanter. And he supplanted Esau and got the birthright. Of course, God was going to work that out anyway. But then the supplanter gets supplanted when he gets down there to Laban, and he thinks he's marrying Rachel, but he's married Leah, and then he marries Rachel. And so you think about the few and evil days, he says, that have been in his life. This is one, I think, a good thing or great thing about the Bible is it reveals the good and the bad about people. They're not Judah. He did some things that were terrible, we read about. And yet our Lord's going to come from the tribe of Judah. So few and evil. But yet how they end up, and I'm so thankful that God doesn't necessarily characterize our life by one event of our lives. But he can see what we can become. We learn from our mistakes, hopefully. We go forward, and what we can become. Because it's interesting that God would choose somebody like Jacob, through whom then Israel would come, and ultimately the Christ would be born. But yet God can see the end. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh, there's the second time, and he goes out from before him. He goes, places his father and his brethren, and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses. In the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Someone read Exodus 1:11, please. Exodus chapter 1 and verse 11.
Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses.
All right. Now I learned that Ramesses doesn't exist yet, this city. Well, how is it that they are dwelling in the land of Ramesses and it's not built until we get to Exodus chapter 1 and verse 11? Anybody got an idea?
Moses is the writer.
That's it. That's right. I've often used this, and somebody might say, you know, when President Reagan was a little boy. Well, when President Reagan was a little boy, he wasn't president. But we call him that because we live on this side of that, right? And so someone said, you know, when I married my wife, and then somebody tried to correct me and say, well, it wasn't your wife until you married her. But there's a figure of speech in hermeneutics called prolepsis, and that's what this is. Speaking of future events, that is, speaking of events because they've already occurred, so the future that is there. All right? So I think that is the case. But what else is significant about Ramesses? It is from here, if you look at Exodus 12:37, that the Israelites will start their journey out of Egypt. The Exodus takes place from Ramesses. Ramesses and Sukkoth, it's called. But I'm learning also that the land of Goshen evidently is Ramesses, because they are dwelling in Ramesses, but yet they're dwelling in Goshen. And that's a fertile place. Ramesses, interestingly also, was named after Pharaoh Ramesses II. That's how it gets its name. Not Ramesses the first, but Ramesses II. Pharaoh. Ramesses was the capital of Egypt from 1319 to 1085 BC. Just a little bit of history. It was a significant place then in Egypt. Well, so they're dwelling in the land of Goshen, and which we then learn. By the way, some commentators will tell you, or some dictionaries, they think that it's another place, but I think biblically it is. I'm trying to remember the name of the place that some dictionaries think that they will place it. But here the Bible tells us that They're in the land of Ramesses, yet they're in the land of Goshen. Therefore, Ramesses would be Goshen. So Joseph nourishes his father and his brethren and his father's household with bread according to their families. There was no bread in all the land because of the famine. So what does Joseph now, here in Egypt, they have no bread. So the Egyptians come to whom for help? To Joseph. Basically, they're coming to their government and asking to help us. And so what does Joseph do in order to provide food for them? How does he just give it to them, or what does he do? He sells it to them, and for money. Okay, so now then they're buying bread, and so Pharaoh's getting pretty wealthy out of this. So the government is, but yet it's not, I don't think, necessarily for his personal use, but you'll see later on what happens. So now then, but it was very sore in the land, in other words, grievous. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan. Has this country ever experienced a situation where it was in dire need and basically nobody had any money? What was that called? The Great Depression. The Great Depression. And some of the folks, especially the older ones that lived through the Great Depression, can tell you some tales about how bad that was. And so when they run out of money, but now they've run out of food, and they come back to Joseph. And so what does Joseph now take from them? Their cattle. All their cattle. Well, probably from their perspective, their cattle's going to die anyway if they don't do something. So the cattle are going to become belonging to Pharaoh or Joseph. And so he gave them bread in exchange for horses and for their flocks and for their herds, for the donkeys. And he fed them with bread and all their cattle for that year. Now then, you come to verse 18, their cattle is gone and their food is gone. So their money is gone, their cattle is gone. And so now then, he said, they come back and they said, we will not hide it from the Lord, from my Lord, talking about ruler here, how that our money is spent. My Lord also hath our herds of cattle. There is not aught left in the sight of my Lord, but our bodies and our lands. That's all we've got left. And so they speak their mind, saying, wherefore shall we die before thine eyes, both we and our land? Our land is dying. We're going to die on it. Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants unto Pharaoh, and give us seed that we may live and not die, that the land be not desolate. There must be some places in Egypt that can still be productive. And he's going to move them about. And I'm thinking that and maybe irrigation, I don't know how they did all of that. Might be interesting to go back and study that. But Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for the Egyptians sold every man his field, and the famine prevailed over them, so the land became Pharaoh's. He removed them to cities from one end of the border of Egypt even unto the other end thereof. So he's displacing them from off of their homeland, so to speak, except for what group of people? The priest. And so even Pharaoh here had a respect. Unfortunately, of course, it'd be paganism. But most people in olden times especially had respect for God, their concept of God. And so they're not going to take the land that belongs to the priest. That's theirs. And so consequently then, they did not take theirs. But he gives them seed. And you come to verse 24, and he says, and it came to pass in the increase that ye shall give the fifth part unto Pharaoh, and 4 parts shall be your own, for seed of the field, and for your food, and for them of your household, and food for your little ones. So we mentioned this Wednesday night, but what percentage then, if you of their produce goes to Pharaoh? It'd be 20%, right? 20%. And you say, wow, that sounds like a lot. But as Wednesday night, do we give at least 20% to our government? At least we do. You think about our taxes. Everything we buy has taxes to it, just about it. But then your income tax, social insecurity tax, and all of those things that we do. So it might be, we look upon it, and of course that's the way they obviously, at least theoretically, pay for things that from which we benefit, hopefully, from that. So 20% is not an exorbitant amount. 4 parts go back to them, and 1/5 or 20% then of their income produce would go back to Pharaoh of that food. There were times that a lot of preachers were paid not in money, but in either food or animals or whatever. And I think I told you about the Brother Gus Nichols, this funny story about him, that he had driven or ridden in a train to a certain location, then had to walk a long distance, and he preached. And of course, you never know what you're going to get paid when you go to some places. Even today, preachers don't know if they get paid. And most people do. Most preachers today have it a lot better than what preachers did yesteryear. But they told him, said, well, just whatever's in the contribution, that's what we pay our preacher that Sunday, their visiting preacher. And he said, he was telling his brother about it. His brother's name was Purvey Nichols, and he preached down here around Jackson, Mississippi area for a while. Clinton, I think it was. And he said, but the odd thing was, he said, the money I got paid is the same amount that I put into the contribution. So he's the only one that put any money in. And Purvey told him, said, see, if you had put in more, you'd have made more. And so that was a funny thing that happened to Brother Gus Nichols. But preachers were sometimes paid in pigs and other things. Brother J.D. Tant was asked to come hold a gospel meeting at a place, but they said, we can't pay you anything. Now, again, this goes back a long time ago. He said, I tell you what I'll do. You add up how much you spend on your tobacco for a year. You add that up, and whatever that amounts to, I'll come for that amount. They added it up and wrote him back and said, there's not a preacher alive worth that amount. And so it's just odd how people have done things for money and so on. But anyway, 20%. Yep. Right. And evidently it's going to produce there in the city, which means probably, yeah, they had land. They had lots of land or whatever. When I say lots, I don't mean huge amount, but yeah, I don't know how. In other words, if everybody got the same amount, maybe so, maybe what they needed or whatever. And but this is not necessarily a democracy, is it? Well, when we think of a city, I'm sorry. Yeah. You know, you're not going, if you don't produce a lot, you're not going to be losing a lot either, are you? And when we think of cities today, we may think of concrete cities and house to house, and you know, most likely those cities in Egypt might not have been what like Memphis is, you know, and things. But even in cities, there are ways to grow food. Interestingly, in Singapore, which has about 5 million people, and it's not a large place at all, It's be like population-wise 5 of Memphis living in a little area. But now at parking lots, they're turning those into green parking lots, and they're growing. They've got concrete crosses like things going up through there, and they're growing food at houses and off of those things, and so they're producing. So, but the most thing that about the the most produce that comes from Singapore is money. They don't grow anything. They import and export, and they do a lot of banking, and so they would rather they make more money that way than they would off of produce. So even the foods, the fruits that we eat there come from places like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, other places like that, I guess, that are actually imported and then exported out of that. Yeah, but I don't know. I'd have to go back and try to say, okay, what size cities were these? What did the cities back that day look like? Well, that's like the city of Ur of the Chaldees was a very prosperous city, but yet probably not like what we think of cities. Well, they're very happy to do this because you'll see verse 25, and they said, "Thou hast saved our lives. Let us find grace in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants." So they're very happy in verse 25 to say, "We will give 20%." In other words, of what you are giving unto us. Well, there have been times, even in our country, where things like this were taken advantage of. We must have a creature crawling around or something. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All right. As long as it's not something life-threatening, and we'll be all right then. But you will remember in maybe Kentucky, Virginia, Alabama, the coal mines. Where did those people who lived and worked around the coal mines, where did they do their shopping? The company store, Tennessee Ernie Ford says, St. Peter don't call me because I can't come because I owe my soul to the company store, he said. So they were paid sometimes, in tokens and others, and then they had to buy there. Yes, ma'am. That's all right. Yeah. Right. Right. Go back into debt. Yeah, it is very circular. And yeah. And so blessings, I mean, a lot of times, and I remember talking with a gentleman, he said, I had $100 bill back during the Depression, but I couldn't spend it because nobody could cash it. My dad, it was told about my dad, my sister was the oldest one in the family. I'm the youngest one. So I live much this other side. But they lived down in the Delta of Mississippi, and the floods had wiped out their crops, and so he made nothing that year. And he said, I just went to the store, and I told the man who owned the grocery store, I have no food, and I have no money. He said, I can't buy any food from you and pay you. And he said, fortunately, the man who owned the grocery store said, just take what you need and then pay me when you can. And so that's how people help. And he said, our neighbor had a cow, and they gave us enough milk in order to, my sister was just a baby at that time, in order to her to have milk. So that's how poor some of them had become during that time, that here you have a baby and you can't even furnish milk, for the baby and food for the baby. And so you don't know where your next meal, is coming from. And so coming out of that depression, and so on. And people were taken advantage of. So I'm thinking about this. This was some rough times for everybody, not just the Israelites, but God is blessing them. and God is taking care of them. And you just think, what if Joseph had not been there? Pharaoh wouldn't have known of the famine. But yet God has something else in mind, and that is, we're going to read about it in the book of Exodus a little bit later on. So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they had possessions therein. Okay, so they've got possessions. They're growing. Their cattle are doing well. And grew and multiplied exceedingly. How many of them, we said, came down into Egypt? 70. And we don't know the exact number of how many came out, but we know everybody who was above the age of 20 who were fighting men, and excluding the Levites and their wives and their children, how many were they? 603,550. That's a lot of people then, right? 603,550. All right? So they did multiply exceedingly, and that's where the book of Exodus is going to begin. And by the way, as we started out in studying the book of Genesis, we pointed out this is the importance of the book of Genesis, because we pick up Exodus and we read they're down in Egypt and they're about to come out of Egypt. They're taking it. How did they get down in there? We would not have known that without the book of Genesis. And so, great book. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the whole age of Jacob was 147 years. 17 years, it's just coincidence, I suppose. That's how old Joseph was when he was sold. And then his father comes back. He had him for 17 years, first 17 years, and then the last 17 years of his life. Then he would have been with Joseph. And the time drew nigh that Israel must die. And he called his son Joseph and said unto him, If now I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and deal kindly and truly with me. Bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt. Have we read of somebody else who asked someone to put his hand under his thigh and make a vow to him? And who is that? Abraham with his servant. I think the thigh must have been like, on my life, you're making this vow. So it was just a way. Sometimes today we put our hand, we go into court, put your hand. Yeah, like a pinky promise. Yeah, but you can't cross your fingers, and get away with it. But it was a unique way that Abraham had done that, and so it must have carried on down. And so it's a solemn vow that you're making to this person that you're going to do what they ask. But this is also, I think, a statement of faith. Jacob knows what's going to happen in years to come. The land of Canaan is going to belong to the Israelites. So you take me back there. Don't leave my body down here in Egypt when I die. And where is he going to be buried? I know it's in the land of Canaan, but do you know where? You probably do and just haven't thought about it. But it's in the cave of Machpelah. You remember we read about the cave of Machpelah? That was over in Hebron. Who bought the cave of Machpelah? Abraham, in order to bury whom? Sarah. Then Isaac will be buried there. And Rebekah, interestingly, we don't have a record of that, but it's stated in the next chapter that Rebekah was buried there. But we didn't have a record of that previous to that statement. And then Jacob wants to be buried there. And who else is going to be buried there? Leah. What about Rachel? She died in Bethlehem, and that's where she was buried. That cave of Machpelah, by the way, which we'll talk about, Lord willing, we'll probably finish this book on Wednesday evening, is on today. There's a mosque, a Muslim mosque there, and for some time people were not allowed in there, but I'm told that people can go in now to visit that particular area of the cave. The word Machpelah means double cave. Double cave. Now, what that means by that, I'm not sure if there's two parts to that cave or what. But he bought the cave and the field and everything then, that the woods that went with that. So, interestingly, as far as Abraham, that's the only land he personally owned in the land of Canaan, was a place to be. But yet, promised that they would have the whole land. That would come through the descendants. But he says, I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me up out of Egypt, and bury me in their burying place. And he said, I will do as thou hast said. And so he's going to follow through it. And he said, swear unto me. And he sware unto him. And Israel bowed himself upon the bed's head. Doesn't mean he died here. He's still going to be alive. We get into the next chapter, and we're going to read about the death of this great man, Jacob. And what an eventful life that he has had. And we will probably on Wednesday evening maybe get through with the book as we summarize some of that. Any questions or comments? Right, exactly, because God had promised it. God had said to Abraham, I'm going to give you all this land. That was restated to Isaac. It was also restated to Jacob. So that's in the back of their minds. Ultimately, then, they may not know the full consequences of that, what's going to happen, but they know, based on God's promise, that that land would be theirs. Now, Moses made a prediction, though, in Deuteronomy chapter 30, when they're about to go in and possess the land. If you depart from God, God will drive you off of this good land. And that's what happened. And that's where we have then, have King Saul, King David, and then King Solomon. Then the kingdom divides, and you have the 10 northern tribes and the 2 lower tribes. They go into captivity in Assyria in 721 BC because of their departing from God. And then Judah will go into Babylonian captivity, ultimately at 3 different occasions, but the last one was in 597 BC when the temple was destroyed and everything. And so then they came back out of their captivity and occupied that land up until the time then that Christ was going to come. And now today, Romans chapter 2, there's neither Jew nor Greek and so on. So, but God had a purpose to bring in the Christ child, keeping his people separate from the rest of the world in order to bring in the Christ, of which we are privileged today, because if you be Christ, then are ye Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So the book is history, but it's actual history. It's not mythology that you have in idolatry and all of the myths that they have. These things are verifiable by archaeology, history, and on we could go, and you just think it's a blessing to be a part of that, isn't it? It is. And so the church is the ultimate fulfillment of that. What a privilege it is then to be a member of the church that God foresaw even before time began. And so God made all that happen. All right, well, we'll stop right there with chapter 48.